Okay, students, I'm trying this a second time. I have a better mount this time for the phone here, so please forgive me about earlier. What this video is about is how to correctly construct an aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve for Unit 2. These are ones where you're solving using first impact. I've got some white paper here. I've got my protractor because we need to draw straight lines and curves lines. You'll need a gray pencil, but I'm using a black pen so the resolution will show up on YouTube. And I've got a blue pen. You can use a blue pencil for the shifting curves. Now, let's start off with talking about size. You need to have both graphs be large enough to where I'm able to read and you're able to read and you're able to see what's actually happening. So for these kind of graphs, you want to make sure that they're about 2 to 2.5 inches long for the vertical axis and 2 to 2.5 inches long for the horizontal axis. Remember, we don't have an X or a Y axis in economics. Instead, we have a vertical and a horizontal axis. Now, your vertical axis is going to be labeled with CPI, which is our measure of overall price levels, and your horizontal axis will be labeled with real gross domestic product, real GDP for short. Now, you should always construct the aggregate supply curve first. The aggregate supply model we are using is called threefold synthesis or three-segment model. It has one segment that is a straight line that is horizontal, which we call the Keynesian segment. You should use the straight edge of your protractor or a ruler if it's not accessible to you. You should have that set up like this here, and you notice it's going to be about 1/3 the total length. You then do a curve. You can freehand it like I'm doing, or if you prefer, you can use the curved edge of the protractor like so, and you're going to draw the intermediate, I should say construct the intermediate segment, which is in the middle, and it transitions from horizontal to vertical. And then the classical segment, which is a straight line, which is straight up vertical, and then you label the top endpoint AS. Really important, everybody, please listen. Do not make this graph look like a backwards letter L. If the intermediate segment is too small, it will not make sense. You will also not have enough room for the AD curve to move or for there to be clear, proper separation with the movement of the macroeconomic equilibrium. It's really important that it's about 1/3 the total length. Additionally, okay, you must have the horizontal segment or Keynesian segment be a horizontal line. It must be straight. It can't be leaning up or down, and it can't be leaning left or right on the classical or vertical segment either. We're going to start with an example that takes place in the intermediate or upward sloping segment. You've noticed probably on problem number 5 on the practice set, problem number 4 on, problem number 5 on the homework, problem 4 on the practice set, that it has the words Keynesian, intermediate, or classical in parentheses, because it's telling you where the starting macro equilibrium actually is. You want to have AD cross AS in the middle, so if there's movement left or right for AD or AS, there's room for the macro equilibrium to move. Please remember the following. The time frame for Unit 2 is 9 months, long enough for a curve to move and for there to be a noticeable movement of the macro equilibrium, if it moves at all, but not so long as it will kick out of one segment into another. That happens in Unit 3 when the time frame is extended to time frames of longer than a year. So we're going to put the AD curve. It should be drawn as a negative slope curve, or constructed, I should say, as a negative slope curve. It should not fold over upon itself. It should never have a positive slope, but it should be a negative sloped curve. You locate your starting macro equilibrium by finding real GDP1 and real GDP, or CPI1 here. We use ones for the starting position. I'm starting off everything in black. You should be using a gray pencil. Now I've got my blue pen here. In one of your problems, it states the following. It states that the government has increased personal income taxes. Now, personal income taxes, do they affect total spending or production costs? Well, income taxes affect what households take home if they're called personal. People's take-home pay determines what they can spend. So this affects spending, and since it's personal, it affects consumer spending. Now, suppose you were being charged more income taxes. Would your paycheck be larger or smaller? If you said smaller, you're correct. So if you have a smaller paycheck, will you spend more or less money? If you said less, that's also correct. So we're going to make a little note over here that consumer spending decreases. Now, when spending decreases, which curve moves? Only aggregate demand moves when spending changes. Does it shift left or right? When there's less spending in the macroeconomy, AD shifts to the left. Now, you need to find a spot that is still in the intermediate segment. 9 months is not long enough for this to kick into the Keynesian segment or horizontal segment. And you're going to move the AD curve by constructing a parallel, similarly shaped AD curve, passing through that spot down and to the left. You're going to put a shifter arrow here. You have to locate the new CPI in blue, CPI2, and the new real GDP sub 2. And you put shifter arrows along the axes as well as shifter arrows, along for the curve. Now, is there a change in the CPI? We need to also make sure we put AD to the left here in our summary information. Well, CPI sub 2 is clearly moving vertically downward. That means it's a decrease. So CPI decreases. You could also say drops. What about real GDP? Well, clearly it's shifting to the left. Leftward shift on the horizontal axis is a decrease, so real GDP decreases. And so this is how you would solve a problem like one of the sub-problems in Homework 2 Problem 5 or practice problem number 4 for Unit 2. Now, please notice, start gray pencil or black pen, change the color for the shifting curve. It doesn't matter that we're not in the classical segment. We still have to construct it, and we also have to still construct the Keynesian segment as well because it has to be accurate. Notice we've got summary information here. You can put it to the right or put it below, but the graph construction needs to be accurate. Now let's go through another one. Sometimes it's not spending that changes. Sometimes it's production costs that change. When we have a change in aggregate production costs, that changes the aggregate supply curve. So again, we're going to construct this about 2¼ 2½ inches by 2½ inches for the axes. So let's get that done first of all. Horizontal axis will be labeled real gross domestic product. Vertical axis will be labeled CPI. Now this time we're going to start in the classical segment. Now, because we're dealing with first impact, 9 months, if we're not in the classical segment, we don't label potential GDP. But for this problem, we will start in the classical segment, so we will label potential GDP. You still have to construct the Keynesian horizontal segment. It must be horizontal. Intermediate must be upward sloping from horizontal to vertical. But since we're going to start classical segment, we need to label a real GDP sub F for potential GDP. Remember, the classical segment models the top of the business cycle. You find a spot in the middle of it. Your AD curve is a negative slope curve. It's not curl over upon itself. You locate your starting CPI, and it would be better to do this with a straight edge. I just want you to be able to see what I'm doing here. And so there's that. That's our starting position. Now, let's suppose for this problem we have something else happen. Suppose the cost of electricity rises. Now, I realize people use electricity, but businesses use probably about 10,000 times as much collectively as households do. Now, since pretty much every business I know of uses electricity, and if you don't have electricity, you can't produce or sell anything, it's definitely a cost of production. But what kind of cost of production is it? Did I say anything about technology that's used in the industry changing? No, I didn't. It's not technological based in the industry. Did I say the cost of electricity went up because of some kind of government regulation or policy? No, I didn't. So it's not government factors affecting cost of production. Because electricity is a necessary ingredient used to produce anything, that makes it a key economic resource. And what's happening here is the cost of key resources increases or rises. Now, question, if resource costs are higher, will there be more or less production? Businesses operate on fixed budgets quarter by quarter, and if major resources suddenly become more expensive, they're going to have to produce less output. So less production means the aggregate supply curve is shifting left. So AS to the left. Now remember, we're going to be dealing with either first impact or macro short run in this entire course. We will never deal with macro long run. So this Keynesian segment does not shift up and down vertically. When the other two segments shift left, the Keynesian or horizontal segment gets shorter to the left. When the other two segments shift right, the Keynesian or horizontal segment lengthens to the right. So since costs are higher and AS is shifting left, we find a spot on the Keynesian segment that's the left of where intermediate is originally joining to it. And we draw a new intermediate segment parallel to the old one about the same length, but it's being done in blue. And you notice it's to the left of the old one, and then we do the same for classical. That makes this AS1, and the new position becomes AS2, and we have a shifter arrow for the AS curve. Now, because we're in the classical segment, that means we don't just have a change in our equilibrium GDP, we have a change in potential GDP. Potential GDP is actually getting smaller. We have a shrinkage in the nation's production capacity because the cost of producing and transporting everything is higher. We also locate the new CPI, and notice the new CPI is higher up vertically. Notice overall prices are rising. What is it called, students, when overall prices rise? If you said inflation, that's correct, but what category is this? Was this caused by an increase in spending? No, it's caused by an increase in production costs, and at the macro level, we call that a negative production shock. An increase in prices that's caused by an increase in production costs, which also includes a drop in real GDP, that's called cost push inflation. That's not part of the problem, but it's something you should notice here. This thing ties together with the other stuff we've been learning about, students. So the CPI increases and real GDP decreases. Now again, you make sure that that classical segment is vertical and a straight line. You make sure you shorten the Keynesian segment when you shift the other segments to the left. Accuracy and clarity is important. Let's work a couple of more, students. Okay. We've worked with intermediate and classical. Let's work with Keynesian for a bit, the horizontal segment of aggregate supply. Now, if you've watched my other videos and if you've read the slides and the chapters, you already know that this aggregate supply curve is based upon the relationship between production costs and GDP in the macroeconomy. What happens with production costs is that, or I should say with production versus prices, I should say in the macroeconomy, is at the top of the business cycle, production is at a maximum called potential GDP. Prices can go up or down, but we don't have any changes in total production. At the bottom of the business cycle, like around the trough and recession, we have a situation where production can vary up or down, get bigger or get smaller. However, you have no variation in prices. You have that normalized recessionary price that's at a low stable level. And so if we start off in the Keynesian or horizontal segment, CPI sub R now applies. Remember, AD needs to pass through the middle of it just in case AD is moving left or right. CPI sub R is our starting macro equilibrium CPI. But now, okay, we've got a different situation here. Please, again, make sure that this is constructed horizontal. It matters a lot. Now, let's suppose the government decides to use expansionary fiscal policy and government spending increases. Well, that makes it easy. Government spending increases has been given in the problem as part of expansionary fiscal policy. Now, which curve changes when there's a change in total spending? Aggregate demand. If total spending increases, which direction does the AD curve shift? It shifts to the right. Now remember, first impact, 9 months. The AD curve does not leave the Keynesian segment where it started. Since AD is moving, that's now AD1. We find a spot to the right in the Keynesian segment. We shift the AD curve to the right, but it doesn't leave the Keynesian segment. That's going to be saved for Unit 2. There's real GDP sub 2. Now notice after AD shifts, look at that macro equilibrium. Remember, this is about a 9-month time lapse. Is there any vertical change in CPI? Well, let me remind you of something. A horizontal line has a fixed vertical height, so there's no change in CPI. CPI stays the same. What about real GDP? Well, it's clearly changing. It's moving to the right, so real GDP increases. Again, summary information here, graph moving. So again, I want you all to understand here that if you constructed this Keynesian or horizontal segment where it's leaning down or up, you'd have a change in CPI, and that cannot happen in a horizontal line. Not if that other line that's intersecting is moving in that horizontal line, it cannot. Accuracy in graph construction is mondo important. We're going to deal with one more, okay? We are going to go back to the classical segment again. We may do two more here. This is one of those cases where more is better than less. But every time you're working these kinds of problems, problem number 5 on the Unit 2 homework, problem 4 on the Unit 2 practice problem set, you always draw these graphs about 2.5 by 2.5. Real GDP is your horizontal axis, CPI is your vertical axis. You must use the straight edge of your ruler or protractor to construct it. Your Keynesian segment is horizontal. It is a straight line. It should be 1/3 the total length. The intermediate segment is upward sloping and a curve, 1/3 the total length. And the classical segment is a vertical line, 1/3 the total length. So there's AS. All righty. Since we're in the classical segment, for this Unit 2 problem, we put real GDP sub F, potential GDP in there. And so AD is going to cross in here. Now, let's suppose that all else being equal, the Federal Reserve raises some interest rates on commercial loans. So as a result, it's more expensive for businesses to borrow money. It's more expensive for them to borrow money than it was before. Now I'm putting my CPI sub 1 here. Your starting macro equilibrium is CPI 1 and real GDP sub F or potential GDP. Businesses borrow money to buy capital resources. That's part of gross private domestic investment spending. If it's more expensive to borrow money, it means it's going to be more expensive for these businesses to buy restaurant equipment, factory equipment, corporations selling bonds to build a factory. It's more expensive across the board. So do you think businesses will borrow and spend more or borrow and spend less? Yeah, a higher cost of borrowing means larger loan payments, which means they're not going to borrow and spend as much, especially on a fixed budget. So that means gross private domestic investment spending will decrease. Class, don't use GPDI. Write the words gross private domestic investment out in full. I'm using this to save space and for time expediency. When there's a decrease in gross private domestic investment spending, which curve is moving? Spending affects AD. Which direction does it shift when spending decreases? That's correct. AD shifts to the left. Does it leave the classical segment? No, it doesn't. For this unit, time frame is 9 months. So we find a spot in the classical segment that is below the original one. Still in the classical segment. Now, something to remember here, ladies and gentlemen, about vertical lines. Vertical lines have a fixed horizontal coordinate. Is there any change in the horizontal coordinate as the AD curve moves to the left? No, it's the same. Real GDP stays the same. What about price level? Oh, it's clearly changing and there's a difference. The new CPI is below the old CPI. So what does CPI do? CPI decreases, you could also say drops. Now, since the spending is decreasing and prices are decreasing, what do we call this? If you said deflation, you're correct. A decrease in price levels over time is called deflation. All righty. We will do one more example. We need to do one where there's a change. Okay, students, we had a brief interruption here because of Wi-Fi issues. I apologize. I see the timer's going, so hopefully this all works out. Okay, we're going to go back to the intermediate segment again. That's the upward sloping segment of aggregate supply. So about 2¼ inches by 2¼ inches here. Real GDP on the right, CPI up top. Keynesian segment is a horizontal line, does not slope up or down. Intermediate segment is upward sloping, transitions from horizontal to vertical. Classical segment is straight up vertical. And let's kind of clean this up just a wee bit here. I'm sorry, it's a little thicker than intended to be. I'll make sure this looks upward sloping. So AD is crossing AS in the intermediate segment. AD is a negative slope curve. Real GDP 1, it's not F because we're not in the classical segment. CPI 1, it's not CPI sub R because we're not in the Keynesian segment. There's your equilibrium point. Now let's suppose, all else being equal, let's suppose that the government decides to deregulate some major industries, like simplify and reduce the level of regulation on, say, energy producers like electricity, petrochemicals, natural gas, and the like. So their costs of production will go down if the government lowers regulations on them, and that'll make the cost of actually producing and selling their products go down. And every business out there uses energy or fuel in some form. This is going to be a production cost issue, but where is it coming from? Are the resource costs dropping? No, it's not the component ingredients. Is it technological change? The word technology didn't even come up. Was it a government factor affecting production costs? Yes, it was. Government regulations are a government factor affecting production costs. So what's happening here is government factors, please write the word government all the way out, I'm using an abbreviation for expediency, reduce production costs. I'm using PROD as an abbreviation, please write the word productions when you do this in your homework, in key industries. When production costs are lower, will there be more or less production? Well, if businesses have less money to spend on production, they can use the same budget to produce more output. So aggregate supplies are production curve. When there's more production, the AS curve shifts to the right. Now let's pay attention, ladies and gentlemen. You do not shift the Keynesian segment down vertically. That's 20 years. We're not going to ever deal with 20 years in this course. You make the Keynesian segment longer. You have a rightward parallel shift of intermediate, and notice AD is still crossing AS in the intermediate segment. Since AS is shifting, the original position is AS1. The new position is AS2. We have a new real GDP sub 2, and we also have a new CPI sub 2. Take a look at that movement. Is the CPI moving? Yes, it clearly is. Is the new CPI higher or lower? It's lower. CPI decreases. What do we call it when the CPI decreases? A decrease in price levels is called deflation. Real GDP is clearly moving to the right. If it moves to the right, what's it doing? It is increasing. Real GDP increases. So, the AS curve shifts right in the intermediate segment. AD is not moving at all. Remember, costs don't affect AD, only spending affects AD. Okay, spending doesn't affect AS, only costs affect AS. It's important to have that distinguishing feature there. Costs go down on the macro level, AS goes right, CPI decreases, real GDP increases. But that is another problem there for y'all to deal with. So it's about time to wrap this up, and so I shall. I'm hoping that this graph construction video where I'm doing this live with a pen is actually useful for y'all. It was requested that I kind of talk through this for some people who may have missed a lecture on it, or people that feel that the step-by-step method with hands works better than, say, with paint. And I hope it's useful. But we're going to be working with this stuff all on Monday, everybody, here in the summer course, or whatever day it's going to be, if this is fall or spring. But I thank y'all very much, and I hope this was good for y'all.